All right, kiddos, we're going to move on with our talk of ecology. We're going to talk about a couple of quick topics today. One really super important, that's the idea of succession. We'll get to that in just a second. If you've taken chemistry already, you probably remember the word limiting reactants. And in fact, a lot of what we're going to talk about here, I sort of just pull straight from chemistry. But a limiting factor, or we call them limiting reactants in chemistry, but it's really just a limiting factor. Basically, it's anything that limits the amount of organisms that are in a given area or a given ecosystem. I like to think about this in terms of, say, making a recipe, or the example that I have here is of assembling a bike. So if we wanted to put a bike together, let's say that we've got 5 parts here. We've got a seat, we've got 2 wheels, okay, and we've got a frame, and then we've got handlebars. And so we've got 5 different pieces here. Really 4, we'll just consider the 2 wheels, that we need 2 of those. So we need 2 wheels and 1 seat, 1 frame, 1 handlebar to be able to make that. And that would basically, this would be our recipe for making 1 bicycle, that we need 1 seat, 1 handle, 2 wheels, and 1 frame to make that bicycle. And what that would mean is, like, if this was our given set of factors, like let's say that these are our abiotic factors for assembling a bicycle, then we could only assemble a certain number of bicycles here. And what seems really odd, what you would think initially is, well, we can only assemble 40 of them, right? Because I'd run out of handles then. But really, if you look at this, I mean, if I need 2 wheels in each case, and I've only got 50, then I can really only assemble 25 bikes. Now, we're not going to actually worry about any of the math part of that really here in biology, but what that means is that in this case, the wheels would be the limiting factor. They're the thing that I'm going to run out of. Biologically speaking, this might be something like, it might be water or temperature or amount of food or any of those types of things. Those are limiting factors. Those are the things that are going to determine how many of that organism that you can possibly have. Now, this ties into another idea, and that idea is that of tolerance. So tolerance is basically how well can an organism survive within the range of stuff that's around it. In other words, within the range of the factors that are around, how well can that organism survive? So there's what we call a range of tolerance, and if you look through the stuff in your book, you'll see this diagram. And basically the idea here is that there's a range of tolerance. So it's not just like everything has to be absolutely perfect. And I think human beings are a great example. I mean, like, it doesn't have to be 72 degrees for human beings to be able to survive. We can survive in a wide range of temperatures. Now, of course, some of that's because we can, put clothes on and adapt and build fire and stuff like that. But I mean, animals and plants do similar sorts of things. They don't do them quite as dramatically maybe as us in the terms of building a fire or putting clothes on, but they have adaptations that allow them to survive. It allows them to have tolerance within a given range. So a given range of food, a given range of temperatures, of water amounts, of really atmospheric conditions, sunlight, all of those things. There's a range that particular species can survive at. And so the middle of that range is what we call the optimum range. So like if we were talking about something like, let's say that we're talking about fish. In the optimum range here in the middle, we've got a lot of fish. This is where fish want to live. And the example that I'm using here is sort of a water temperature. As long as we're within this certain range of temperature, like let's say that the range is, from 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. As long as we're within that range of temperature, the fish are okay. If we go below that or we go above that, even a little bit, we get into what's called a zone of physiological stress. Physiological, sort of fancy term, just means that, the physiology, the chemical makeup of the body starts to break down a little bit. They don't function as well. And so within that stress, they're going to start to lose numbers. You see the rapid drop off. The red line here in the graph is the population. And so it drops off if the temperature is too cold or if the temperature is too hot, basically if you're anywhere outside of that optimum range. And then you get to, at the ends of the graph here, you get to what's called the zone of intolerance, which basically just means that that organism can't survive there at all, that once you get down below a certain temperature, you're not going to have any of these fish, or if the water's this hot, then there's no fish either, that they just die off and they can't reproduce and there's no population there at all. So you've got a range of tolerance in those ways. Okay, so that's the idea of limiting factors and tolerance. So for the limiting factors, remember that there's a tolerance range for that limiting factor. If we say that, well, what matters the most is the pH level of the soil, there's a range of pH that, say, that plant can survive in. That's the tolerance range. So you've got a limiting factor, and then you've got tolerance to that factor, and really other factors as well. The second term that I want to talk about today is succession. So succession, and this isn't the same as secession. Okay, we're not talking about states leaving the Union. Succession means that there's a change in species over an area. Okay, we have this idea, and part of it's because human lifespan is not really that terribly long, and so we have this idea that an area doesn't really change a lot ecologically speaking, but they really do. Ecosystems and biomes really, as a whole, they change over the course of hundreds of years or thousands of years, or especially over millions of years. And that gradual change in species over time that's going to come about from the evolutionary adaptations, that's what we call ecological succession. So there are two main types of succession that we want to think about. The first one is primary succession. We don't really see a whole lot of this. Primary succession would be that you have biotic things, in other words, living things, that are going to grow up in an area that was pretty much lifeless before. That there wasn't a lot of life there originally, and that now, we're going to start to see some organisms move in. We don't see that a whole lot. Like this is an example of like an area where basically everything's been, bulldozed out, or maybe there's been a disaster there or something. I think volcanic surfaces are great because they're basically killing off any type of life, bacterial or otherwise, that's immediately around them. And so as they cool and as the volcanic rock starts to break down and form soil, you're going to get that primary succession that's going to start up. Another place that we might see it is in a place like a parking lot, where it's basically, it has to be a blank slate, essentially nothing there for it to be primary succession. Now, technically speaking, something like this, a lot of these aren't really primary because they're living organisms there, but we're talking about there's not much life there, and then it's going to, over the course of time, more and more life will be able to come in that area. What we get much more often is what's called secondary succession, and secondary succession is basically just that there was stuff there, okay, and then something happened that didn't disturb the soil really, that the soil and the nutrients are still there, and that new things are going to grow there. The classic example of that is something like a forest, and there's a forest fire. And so like if you look at this diagram, this is a forest over in Europe over the course of like 5 or 6 years. They had a fire. You see that there's almost nothing left on the ground, no sorts of underbrush. The trees don't have much on them. And then over the course of years, this is a year later, I want to say this is 3 years later, and then like 5 years later, you really start to see organisms coming up. And what's interesting here is they're not necessarily the same organisms that they were the first time around. Maybe the conditions have changed. Maybe the fire did something to the moisture levels, or maybe it affected the pH levels. And so new organisms have a chance then to come in and sort of take over. And they're succeeding the organisms that were there before them. Now, this takes a long time. This is not like a simple, one-step process. Primary succession in particular takes hundreds of thousands of years. We talked about secondary could be, 5, 6, 10, 20 years. But primary succession will take hundreds of thousands of years. And I'm going to just sort of real briefly here sort of run us through the progress of a succession, particularly of a forest. And so you've got essentially nothing at the beginning, and then you have what are called pioneer organisms that start to move in. If it's primary succession, these are usually just like mosses and lichen and stuff. If it's secondary, it's the grasses that initially start to grow up. The reason that it's different is in primary, you don't have the soil growth there really, and so you need mosses and lichens to essentially attach onto the rock and then to break the rock down to actually form the soil. So those are what we call pioneer organisms. That just means they're the first ones to move in when succession happens, whether it's primary or secondary. And then typically we've got stuff like grasses and perennials. Now we said that grasses could be pioneers, but maybe some hardier grasses, maybe some different kinds of grasses are starting to move in. Actually, not hardier, but maybe some ones that aren't as hardy because now there's soil that's been grown there by the pioneer organisms. Things like flowers and stuff will then start to be able to move into that area, particularly if we're talking about a forest. Again, for a forest succession, the next step then would be that you start to get some shrubs, you start to get some actual woody plants start to move in. And then, of course, your next couple of stages, you're going to start to get actual trees moving in. So you're going to get fast-growing trees like a pine or something like that. And then you would get to what we call a climax community. And the climax community basically means that we're at the end of the succession phase and that now things are stable. Everything is basically in balance. The ecosystem has enough biodiversity to sustain it, and everything kind of works out most of the time. Now, it says it's final and stable, but of course we said that, I mean, the reason we have succession is because things change. And of course, this can change. If something dramatic happens to that ecosystem, maybe portions of it are logged out, part of it is cut off. Maybe the rainfall due to climate change isn't the same. Maybe there's a forest fire, as we just said, and then we can go into another cycle of succession after that. So the idea here that you want to get in your head for succession is that it's basically just changing what was originally in the ecosystem. Now, you know what may actually happen is you could get a lot of the same organisms back, particularly like if it's a forest fire and maybe it was just part of the forest fire. You might start to get similar types of organisms come back because they're still existing in the general area. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be completely different organisms. Now, what happens as succession happens is that it's going to increase the biodiversity. As you get more and more organisms in, you get more biodiversity. What that means is there's more and more different kinds of organisms. So what that does is it makes things more stable because you've got a broader food web and things are drawing from different parts of the food web. And so you're not relying on like one food source, like, oh, it's one type of grass and all the herbivores are eating that one type of grass. If there's a bunch of different plants that the herbivores are able to eat, and then therefore a bunch of different herbivores, so that they can support different types of carnivores, so that they can eventually support those apex predators, then more biodiversity makes everything more stable. We're going to talk a lot more about biodiversity later, but succession helps to lead into that increased biodiversity. As succession continually occurs, we're getting more and more biodiversity. Therefore, we're going to get more stable environments out of that eventually.